All right, guys, Murph's here. And today, at viewer request, we are going to compare 6.5 Grendel to 6mm arc. I was surprised to find out that this is actually an exceedingly hot topic. Now, keep in mind, I have no personal experience with either one of these cartridges. I am aware of their existence. I'm aware of their technical data and all that kind of stuff. I have looked into the cartridges prior. I even considered building a 6.5 Grendel at one point. Originally, my MK12 Mod Murph, previously reviewed and update reviewed on the channel, link in the description, was going to be in 6.5 Grendel, but I built that in 2020 and there was no 6.5 Grendel on any website and there was definitely none in my local shops, so I did not wind up going with a 6.5 Grendel at that point. I instead built the 5.56 Mark 12 that we know and love today. There are a ton of forums and Reddit threads where people are violently arguing the pros and cons of the 6.5 Grendel over the 6mm arc. So that is a topic that we're going to tackle today. First, we're going to introduce our players. The 6.5 Grendel is a cartridge that was developed in the early 2000s in order to replace the 5.56. Now, as I've discussed in a video previously, a lot of cartridges have tried to replace 5.56, and yet 5.56 has persevered every time. So I always kind of chuckle to myself whenever it is that somebody highlights this cartridge is supposed to replace the 5.56, because it's still here, still kicking, 60 years, still going. The complaint at the time was that the 5.56 was having a tendency to ice pick through targets and it wasn't effectively transferring energy, causing enough tissue disruption, all that kind of stuff. So there was a trend towards a larger cartridge, more surface area, more mass, more tissue disruption, more. And the 6.5 Grendel was developed in order to address that. As we can see, the 5.56 persevered, and the 6.5 Grendel has clung to relevancy, skirting the edge of obscurity. And I'm not saying that it's a bad cartridge. I'm saying that the cartridge has not necessarily blown up in a big way, minus it got adopted by Serbia. That's like the biggest win for the cartridge right now. The 6mm arc was developed more recently and was meant to fulfill the requirement of some organization within the military in order to be able to have an AR-15 punch out to greater distance with greater accuracy. Now, first off, the thing I want to go after, whenever it is that we talk about these like niche specialty cartridges and stuff like that, there's always some shadowy organization within the government that requested that this cartridge be developed. But there's never an organization named, and it makes me really suspicious. I feel like this is just some sort of like selling point. This is a made-up selling point, kind of like what I suspect Sig did with the M11A1, which if you're interested in that review, go ahead and check out the link in the description. Sure, there are plenty of organizations at any time are like, you know what, hey, we would like this, and they, write a white paper on it, they get the attention of people who matter, money gets sent their direction, and then they start working on like building the requirements, sending it out to the industry, getting examples back, going through the trials process and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of trials that end in nothing. If you guys remember the individual carbine program, that would be a prime example. The XM8, oh man, the XM8 is going to be the coolest new thing ever. It's going to be so neat. It's this futuristic polymer, HK-36 looking weapon, and then you got the 416 and all these different manufacturers presenting rifles for the program, and the program was stillborn. The government was just like, M4's fine. M16's fine. Everything's fine. We don't need anything else. Everyone was like, oh, okay, cool. Thanks, man. Or like, for example, some programs take longer than others. I remember reading an article in 2008 talking about the Army wanting to replace the M9. And it took 10 years for us to get the M17. So there's some give and take in that. And of course, whenever it is, if a program is not successful, or even if a program is successful, the manufacturer turns around and wants to get their money back from R&D by selling their product to the public. I find it really sus that no one ever names an organization whenever it is like, oh yes, this group wanted this. We can't say their name. Okay, so we signed an NDA or something along those lines. Regardless, 6mm arc was developed, and really what I feel like brought 6mm arc into the spotlight, more solidly into the spotlight, was Grendel V doing a video on it, because then all of a sudden people I knew who had zero interest in the 6 arc to begin with were just babbling on about the 6 arc all the time. Okay, I see what happened here. Influencers be influencing, it seems. All right, so there's our players introduced. Why don't we go ahead and talk about what these cartridges have in common, because it's a lot. Both of them were built for the AR-15. They were built to go into an AR-15 style weapon system. So all you have to do is swap out the bolt in the barrel, and then you're able to run 6.5 Grendel or 6mm arc. They do work with Stanag magazines, though at a diminished capacity. And they're these fat little cartridges with long, slender projectiles that have great ballistic coefficients and great sectional density. They'll handle going through the transonic barrier really well. They'll maintain great accuracy at distance, flatter shooting trajectories, all this kind of stuff. Both remain supersonic out to 1,000 meters, which is pretty impressive coming out of something the size of an AR-15. And that's where the similarities end. Now, guys, this conversation normally is a lot more contextual than it is technical. However, these cartridges are incredibly similar in so many ways, which makes contextual extremely difficult to vet out. We'll get to a contextual portion before this is all said and done, but we're going to lean more heavily into a technical portion to begin with. Now, where are these cartridges different? The 6.5 Grendel comes in loadings from 90 to 130 grains, which I'm sure is some disparity on either side of that, moving from 2,500 to 2,800 feet per second. For factory loads in the 6 arc, it seems like you're looking at 103 to 108 grains. I'm sure there's some outliers on either side. And 2,800 feet per second, or maybe a little dip into 2,700 feet per second, but we're not looking at that big of a difference in grain weight, so it's generally 2,800 feet per second. It's easier to just round up at this point. Okay, well, you can have very similar velocities out of these two rounds, Murph, and you are correct. That is true. However, you have to go to the 90 grain loading to get that 2,800 feet per second. And a 90 grain 6.5 millimeter projectile at 1,000 meters is going to behave very differently than a 103 grain projectile of the 6 millimeter arc. Even at half a millimeter of difference, that half a millimeter actually might prove to be the might prove to be to the disadvantage of the 6.5 Grendel, because we don't have more mass. We actually have less mass than we have in the 6mm arc. And though we still have that long, slender projectile that is going to cut through the wind really nicely, that 103 grain 6mm arc is dense. That's a dense little guy. It's going to resist wind really well. The 90 grain 6.5 is not as dense. So, and it's now a little bit wider, so there's more surface area for wind to act on. I would expect to see a lot more wind drift with the 6.5 Grendel. Now, also, with most of the velocities favoring the 6mm arc, we know that the 6mm arc will have a flatter shooting trajectory. Now, one of the key things to keep in mind here, first off, 6.5 cartridges are not new. People act like 6.5 Creedmoor invented the 6.5mm, but like we had the 6.5 Swedes, 6.5 Japanese. There's all these other 6.5 cartridges, all of which have generally flat shooting trajectories, but they are not laser beams. And that's where people really get things out of hand. They're like, oh, you don't even have to like correct your sights. It's like, you do. You do. A 6.5 Creedmoor actually has a surprising amount of drop for the amount that people talk about how it's just flat shooting cartridge, but it's flatter than other options available on the market. 6mm cartridges have been dominating in the precision rifle space for an exceedingly long time. A lot of your top shooters are shooting some form of 6mm. So both of these are great long-range performers. They're just, and this kind of paints our whole conversation that has already happened and is going to happen, they're just slightly different. And is that slight difference enough to matter? Now, the first thing that I want to lean into here is our velocities. Those velocities were taken with a 24-inch barrel. Now, a 24-inch AR-15 is going to be heavy in comparison to what something shorter would weigh, and a little ungainly. Something that a lot of people don't necessarily, I think, have enough respect for is how much weight a barrel actually constitutes. That's a big chunk of metal, and it's also a big chunk of metal as far away from you as a big chunk of metal can be. That really changes like your balance association with that weight. So as you add more barrel in a 24-inch type setup, you wind up with quite the front-heavy arrangement, let alone if you add a suppressor. So with that being the case, what if we looked at some options that were much shorter? So since there was a military interest in the 6mm arc, or military drive for a precision rifle in the 6mm arc, perhaps looking at something like an SPR would be best. So an 18-inch barrel. What are the velocities going to look like in an 18-inch barrel? Now this is based off of a 108 grain load for the 6mm arc and a 123 grain load for the 6.5 Grendel, which is the most common 6.5 Grendel load out there. In an 18-inch barrel with the 6mm arc, we expect to see 2,600 feet per second. Whereas the 6.5 Grendel will be coming in at 2,500 feet per second. Now, to ground this whole conversation, a 24-inch 6.5 Grendel will achieve 2,600 feet per second. So the 6 arc is coming down to the velocity of the 6.5 Grendel. And there's a 100 foot per second difference between 6.5 Grendel and 6mm arc, favoring 6mm arc. So 2,500 feet per second versus 2,400 feet per second. That's not that big of a difference, if I'm being completely honest. And if necessary, if I really wanted to get to the same velocity, I could go with a different load. Like if I go with a lighter load, I'm going to achieve or eclipse the velocity that I'm getting out of the 6mm arc. Same thing with the 6mm arc. If I drop down to 103 grain load, I can expect that I'm going to continue this cat and mouse game, bouncing back and forth with velocities. So sticking with, taking a hard line on what it is that we're talking about right now, 100 feet per second difference within the engagement envelope of a designated marksman is not that bad. It's really not. So yes, the 6.5 Grendel is technically going to peter out a little sooner than the 6mm arc, but I think we're still in a condition of if you can see it, you can shoot it. And coming back to the mass type question. So 123 grain projectiles, less than 25% additional mass to the 6mm, but it is more. And if you're going to be living at a distance and you want to make sure that you're killing your opponent, you're going to want that additional tissue destruction. You're going to want that additional mass, that additional surface area in order to be able to disrupt as much tissue as you possibly can. So this is a case where that little bit more might be better. But with the 6mm having a little bit flatter shooting trajectory, well, I know it's going to get there. And dead's dead. Shot's shot. I don't want to get shot. I don't want to get shot with anything, be it 6.5 or 6mm. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm not going to sit here and split hairs as to which one I would prefer to get shot by. We can see here that the disparity is not that wild. What if we went to something that might favor the 6.5 Grendel? The 6.5 Grendel was meant to replace like the M4 and the M16. So what if we drop this down to a 14.5 inch barrel discussion? Same loads, 108 and 123 grain loads. We would expect to see a 2,500 foot per second result for the 6mm arc, and the 6.5 Grendel moving at 2,400 feet per second. So yet again, another 100 feet per second difference in having gone down to a 14.5 inch barrel. I am still incredibly impressed at the lack of impact with the shortening of the barrels. And I'm not bothered by these velocities in the engagement envelope of a 14.5 inch rifle. So if we're talking about shooting out to 300 meters, yeah, on a man-sized target, these cartridges would perform extremely admirably. And I have difficulty telling like what makes me want to pick one over the other. They both perform just fine. One's not doing something unequivocally better than the other. And if I change up the loads, I also impact those velocities in that way. So I'm actually getting a lot out of both cartridges. This makes it incredibly difficult to be able to pick them apart. So what if we started to dive into more of a contextual portion of this discussion, Murph? Okay, let's get contextual for a minute. Set that there. You live there now. What do you think the answers are to these questions here, Murph? Like, where does this cartridge live, or what are your interests in it? I've got to tell you, if you sat down right now and were like, Murph, you have to pick one, 6.5 or 6mm, 6.5 Grendel or 6mm arc, which one are you taking? I would sit here and go, I don't care. It doesn't matter. 5.56, I guess, because it's cheap and plentiful, and I already have a bunch of rifles built out in it. And I think that is the end state here. These cartridges are so close to one another. It's legitimately, who cares? Just pick one. You'll be fine. Everything will be fine. You have to get into like the deepest levels of autism in order to be able to discern how one of these could possibly be better than the other. But Murph, you have to give us an answer. You can't take a cop out like that. Where do I see these cartridges playing? Well, first off, 24 inches or somewhere around that length as precision rifles. I think I favor the 6mm arc in that case. specifically because I have less recoil and I have a flatter shooting projectile. So that gives me a better opportunity to be able to observe impacts. Either one of these cartridges, it's gonna suck trying to observe impacts at 1,000 meters. If you don't have like an extremely dry, dusty environment that's giving you a nice plume every time a round hits the ground, if you're dealing with like grassy, grass that has recently rained on, it's not necessarily a mud hole, but like it is soft ground, or if you're dealing with like dense foliage, like field type conditions, even mud's still gonna not necessarily give you the best geyser to be able to track impacts off of and stuff like that. That could really lead to how successfully you complete your engagements and stuff like that out to distance. So the 6mm, especially if I pair it with like a good muzzle brake or a suppressor or something like that, it'll keep the rifle nice and flat so that I can observe what is going on downrange and make my corrections accordingly. When we talk about hunting rifles, again, playing around that 24 to the over 18-inch length, the 6.5 Grendel has a little bit more interest to me, even though both of these cartridges will perform admirably on medium-sized game out to 500 meters and still be within an ethical shooting envelope. So either would be acceptable for hunting. It's, again, who cares? But the 6.5 Grendel, a little bit bigger bullet, a little bit more energy, a little heavier, all that kind of stuff. Better chance that I'm going to effectively harvest that game. If we drop down into like the 18-inch range, like an SPR or something along those lines, I think 6mm arc does it for me. Lighter cartridge and carry more of the ammunition. Flatter shooting trajectory, once again, better be able to observe impacts and all those types of things. Lighter recoiling, but you could also just as easily convince me, for the same reasons that I prefer to hunt with the 6.5 Grendel, that I should take the 6.5 Grendel for an accurized rifle. I don't feel like I lose either way, especially if I don't have to buy the ammunition. What about in the 14.5 length, more for like a battle rifle or something along those lines? I think I favor the Grendel. I think I like having a little bit heavier bullet. I think I like having a little bit more mass and all that kind of stuff to cause more tissue damage, because the two cartridges at the ranges that we're talking about are going to perform effectively the same. The slightly flatter shooting trajectory of the 6mm arc at 300 meters is just not, it's not going to be a deciding factor for me, whereas I might favor having more of the energy at this point and going with the 6.5 Grendel. Both of these rounds are going to be relatively expensive. They're definitely going to be more expensive than 5.56. So if somebody sat me down and was like, well, Murph, what do you want between these two? I'd say 5.56. I'd say 300 blackout even. Possibly 7.62 by 3.9, because they better match what I do in my life. I don't do precision shooting. I really don't hunt that much anymore either. I primarily run tactical rifles and things along those lines. So those, 7.62 by 3.9, 5.56, 300 blackout, those hold more interest to me. But honestly, you know what? Sitting down and building out an 18-inch 6mm arc and a 14.5, 6.5 Grendel wouldn't bother me. Not all that much. Along with, a super short 300 blackout setup and then like a 16-inch 5.56. I feel like you'd have a really well-rounded collection at that point. And who doesn't want more guns? Everyone should have more guns. Now, one of the biggest things that would dampen my interest in either cartridge is the fact that I'm going to have to go with a thinner bolt head, like bolt face, in order to be able to accommodate those fat cartridges. And that does not make me happy. That's one of the issues that I have with 7.62 by 3.9 chambered AR-15s. You wind up really decreasing the life of that bolt. Like those locking lugs and stuff like that are going to shear at an earlier round count than they would if they were a 5.56 or a 300 blackout. So that's a contextual thing to take into account there. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.